Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good on you, Aaron. Thank you for that. Good evening to everybody. Great to be here. Welcome to the show. I'm Steve Price tonight, filling in for Peter Credlin. Now, we've got a lot of breaking news out of the Middle East. As it unfolds, you'll see it here on Sky right through the night and into tomorrow morning. We've got the ceasefire, obviously, that kicked in about 2 hours ago. You've got hostage swaps, hopefully, and you'll see it right here. So don't leave it. We'll have all the breaking news. Here's what's coming up tonight, though, on Credlin. History has a way of repeating itself. Now, under two former Labor Prime Ministers, Australia was swamped with illegal boat arrivals. We all remember how bad that was. The coalition stopped the evil trade, but it could be back. 12 people were picked up on the mainland in the Kimberley. Details to come through the program. Also tonight, as I mentioned, the world is holding its breath as we go to air, and it will be a ceasefire, we hope, in Gaza that holds. Now, will the hostages be freed? We don't know. Will Hamas abide by the deal? We'll talk to senior defence analyst Malcolm Davis about that coming up shortly. And Chris Bowen, our renewable energy zealot and minister, is off to yet another UN climate conference. This time he's flying into Dubai. But will he face, as reported today, an ambush by those people who want to push nuclear energy? Perhaps. And more on the pro-Palestine marches, those rallies by young children across Australia today. This time it was in Sydney. Joel Burney from the Australian Jewish-Israeli Council will talk about those disturbing scenes of the students yesterday and their anti-Semitic chants. But first up, we'll keep an eye on the news breaking out of Gaza, as I said. But with that ceasefire kicking in and hours to go, the preparation there is really underway. We'll keep an eye on that, as we say. But first, I want to talk about some names that we all remember and have in common. Kevin Rudd, Anthony Albanese, Tony Burke and Mark Dreyfus. What is it that those four have in common? Well, let me tell you, the disastrous Rudd-Gillard-Rudd governments, and it was a chaotic disaster second time around for Kevin Rudd, those four cabinet ministers were central to the failed border protection that in the end saw 50,000 illegal boat entries on 800 boats with an estimated 1,200 men and women and children dying at sea. Now, it's an estimate only because, tragically, we will never know the true figure. And who could ever forget the midweek horror? I can remember sitting watching this in 2010 with Julia Gillard in charge. It was December, when a leaky wooden people-smuggling boat laden with desperate illegal refugees, ripped off by people smugglers, was smashed apart against the rocks of Christmas Island. Those pictures just resonate with all Australians. So shocking were the pictures that Australians demanded everything be done to try and smash the people-smuggling syndicates operating out of Indonesia. Operation Sovereign Borders was born. We had boat turnbacks. They happened. The Navy, Border Force, they cracked down on people smugglers' organisations. Now, boat people were relocated, as we know, to Nauru and to Manus Island in Papua New Guinea during that time. Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison, in those years, guess what? The boats stopped. They stopped coming. No more heartbreaking deaths at sea. Labor and the Greens, of course, well, they hated the policy. The Greens back then, and still, disgracefully, want open borders. They don't care who comes, where they come from. They just classify them all as legitimate refugees, checks or no checks. The Labor left, think about Tony Burke, Anthony Albanese, they hate offshore detention. They always have. So the Prime Minister, Burke and Dreyfus are all back, with Rudd, of course, sitting in Washington as the Australian ambassador and pontificating on all things China. Now, Albanese is Prime Minister, Dreyfus is the Attorney General, and Tony Burke is the Leader of the House. So, 10 years after Labor's last disastrous attempt to secure our borders, I have a horrible feeling history is about to repeat itself. Now, the boats are back, and I suspect we don't hear about most of them. Some suggestion there may have been, since this new government's been there, around 12. But we have operational silence, well, until this week. Now, in about as remote a part of Australia as you could possibly get, the Kimberley, a spot on our mainland that is as close as you can get to Java, 12 people were discovered by local Indigenous landowners on Australian soil. Now, it wasn't Christmas Island, that legally at least is not part of our country, but it was on the mainland. They got here. The coast where they landed is near a RAF base. It was an airstrip that was constructed in 1944 for heavy bombers to attack the advancing Japanese because it was so close to Indonesia. It's remote, it's crocodile infested, and it's a miracle that these people, whoever they are, actually survived. Now, just this evening, the Nine papers are reporting that those 12 asylum seekers, or fishermen, we don't yet know, have been taken to Nauru. They could be fishermen, but why would you take them to Nauru if they were fishermen? Border Force won't comment, but the government needs to. Now, the important point is they got here. And they got here after that High Court decision that saw over 100 illegal asylum seekers freed. Some of them rapists, murderers, domestic violence offenders, even pedophiles. One had raped a 10-year-old. These people got out on the streets. Now, a coincidence maybe, but that High Court message, that shows that there is a crack in what had been a very strong wall in Australia. Now, that would not have been lost on the criminal gangs in Indonesia selling seats on those boats. And even if they turn out to be fishermen, why were they actually on shore? Now, Australians have got every right to be worried. We are bringing in already 500,000 legal migrants a year in a migrant policy that's madness in itself. The country cannot cope with that number. Surely we can't allow this desperate trade that used fled detention centres for years under Rudd and Gillard. We don't want it to start again. Now, Labor's got a dreadful record on migration, legal and illegal, and the same old names are back in charge. This is not going to end well. Now, once news gets back to Java, the people smugglers, guess what? The boats will start all over again. And Opposition Leader Peter Dutton was right today to query whether the aggressive Operation Sovereign Borders has been wound down. We need to know that. No boats can be allowed to come. We can't have this happen again. I'll talk it through with our panel first up, but let's check what's happened today in Canberra.
Good evening. The opposition has ramped up its attack on the Albanese government over its decision to grant visitor visas to Palestinians amid the Israel-Gaza war. Since Hamas's terror attack on October 7, Australia has issued 860 visas to Palestinians and about 1,800 visas to Israelis. Most of the recipients have a close connection to Australia, such as having a parent or child living here. But Peter Dutton has questioned the speed in which those visas have been processed.
The inadequacy of these checks could result in a catastrophic outcome in our country. Taking people out of a war zone without conducting the checks, particularly those that are available to us in the US, is reckless.
The federal opposition has committed to a trial of age verification technology if it wins the next election that would stop children accessing online pornography and gambling. The government is hesitant to move forward with a trial now, favouring a more holistic approach to reduce the volume of harmful content children are exposed to online.
It normalises a sexual behaviour that is not normal in our society. And what we're supporting here is a trial for 2 years, which is the recommendation of the E-Commissioner. Instead, the Prime Minister sided with the pornography industry, who praised the Albanese government for this decision. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
The government has tasked the E-Safety Commissioner with creating an industry-wide safety code. It's concerned age verification technology is still in its infancy and that requiring biometric scans or uploading ID documents to access adult websites would bring a raft of additional privacy risks.
There would be no decent-minded Australian who wants children to access age-inappropriate material, including pornography. The ability and the efficacy of the systems that currently exist for age verification are immature and also carry significant risks in terms of privacy and their ability to be implemented overall.
Those industry codes could take years to put into place.
Bruce Lehrmann has denied accusations he raped Brittany Higgins, ignoring 6 pleas she made for him to stop. The former Liberal staffer was adamant he did not have sex with his then colleague, telling a court this did not happen. He endured a forensic cross-examination by Network 10's barrister on the third day of his defamation trial against the channel and its former star host Lisa Wilkinson. Mr. Learman denied trying to get Miss Higgins drunk on the night she accused him of raping her. He was shown footage of himself and Miss Higgins drinking with a group of colleagues that night, in which Miss Higgins was seen consuming 6 spirit-based drinks.
Good on you, Joel. Thank you very much for that. Lots to get through now. Joining me to get the latest is One Nation Chief of Staff James Ashby joins us each Friday, and founder of the PR Council, Christy McSweeney. Christy and James, welcome. Great to see you again. I guess I can start with you, James. You heard that editorial I had there. Does it look to you like history's about to repeat itself?
Oh boy, doesn't it what? It starts with 12 and as we saw under Gillard and Rudd, it ends up being 50,000 or even potentially more this time around, because let's face it, we don't have the same luxuries that we did back under the coalition government to be able to put these people in long-term offshore detention, let alone detention even here in Australia. So this is a big, big concern when you've got a Labor government more interested in protecting its reputation than it is protecting our borders here in Australia. And the one thing we do know is that the government at this present moment have said, look, none of these people will be given permanent residency in Australia. What a load of rubbish. We heard those promises made during the last term of Labor's government, and yet just 150 kilometres down the road from me at Biloela, we've got a family that was told that they would never settle in this country, had been put through the Federal Court on numerous occasions, the High Court on a final decision. They were proven not to be true refugees, and yet this government, it was Anthony Albanese, that more or less gave this family a pardon and a free ticket to Australia. So a lot of these people sitting in offshore locations, whether it be Indonesia or any of those Muslim nations, are thinking to themselves, hey, we've got a free ticket to Australia and the High Court's just given us the green light, as Peter Dutton said.
Well, Labor has obviously copied the former government, the former coalition government's practice of not telling us anything about on-water activities, as they put it. But I think the Australian public, Christy, at least needs to be told, does it not, whether these people are fishermen or whether they're asylum seekers who've been brought here by people smugglers. We at least need to know that, don't we?
The Labor opposition relentlessly pursued the coalition, particularly Scott Morrison, for claiming operational matters, and that is now coming back to haunt them. The golden rule of politics is people don't need to make up things that you've said. You've likely said it yourself. So we can now see that Labor's claiming the same tactic, for better or for worse, and it is for worse for the Australian public. Labor's been caught flat-footed on the issues of detention, of immigration, of border protection. We know it's very difficult for them. We know the left of the Labor Party has been scratching at the surface of Labor's bipartisan resolve with the coalition to support border protection and detention. And now, of course, we have a left-dominated caucus. Those cracks are starting to show. The Attorney-General has spent the last 6 months trying to negotiate legislation for a referendum that never came to pass. And so that is where Labor's legal focus has come to at the moment. And again, they have not been concentrating on immigration and border protection. That's been very, very clear, and the Australian public will be asking questions around what the priorities are.
James, it's really interesting, isn't it? The same old names keep coming back. I mean, you've got Dreyfus, you've got Tony Burke, you've got Anthony Albanese, and of course Kevin sitting over there in Washington. I looked back over when that actual incident took place, where that boat broke apart on Christmas Island, and I think that was a pivotal point in this whole discussion about whether people had a right to come here as refugees or not. But they're all back again, the same people who screwed it up last time are in charge again.
Well, this is typical of Labor. They never learn from their lessons. The other issue that I see is until we have a change of government, this won't end, Steve. It really won't. Peter Dutton is the only person to speak with authority on stopping the boats illegally arriving here in Australia. The coalition have got formed. They at least stopped the boats. Yes, we had put people into offshore detention centres that cost Australians tens and tens and tens upon tens of billions of dollars. And unfortunately, we all had to pay that. But it would have cost us a whole lot more if we continued to allow them to come. Now, the important part here is strong Conservative people like One Nation have got to be in the Senate so that if this coalition can be successful at the next election, the Greens don't put a stop to the change of legislation that the coalition would bring to stop these boats. So it is so important that we change the dynamics of the Senate in the future, as well as change the government at the next federal election.
Chrissy, you're an expert on messaging. The PM went to that last election and he pledged to restore integrity to politics. Now, it's clear that he's not come anywhere near fulfilling that promise. He's been accused of misleading us all over claims he'd not taken leave this year. He's been called out for hypocrisy on his assertion that he doesn't talk about private conversations with world leaders. Australians, do you get a sense that the trust that was so pivotal to Anthony Albanese getting elected because people had been turned off Scott Morrison is sinking away at a rapid rate?
I feel that the government has spent the first half of this political cycle focusing on issues of priority that just don't resonate with the Australian population. That's been proven. And we have now seen the judgment being called into question. I'm not sure about integrity, but I can categorically say people are starting to question the judgment of what the priorities are and having the finger on the pulse in terms of what's resonating with the Australian people. I think the Teals campaigned on integrity. I think they own that. It's very difficult for major parties to own integrity just because they are major parties, and they do have to deal with minor parties, particularly in this constant cycle of minority governments or very close to it that we have been seeing in Australia over the last 10 to 15 years. That becomes very, very difficult to own integrity and transparency when a lot of the things you're promising to crossbenchers and independents aren't full of transparency at all. So the Teals have nailed that one. The Labor Party certainly hasn't, and I don't think the coalition has either.
Chrissy, I've got a job for you. I note you're in Hobart. When we've finished here, can you go out in the street and ask them what they think of Tanya Plibersek's idea that she's going to shut down a $1.3 billion salmon industry because some environmental group reckons that something called, and I can't even pronounce it, the Maguin skate could become extinct. See how that goes down in the main street of Hobart.
I think there'd be an absolute mutiny. And, you know, everywhere else around Australia, you have people misguidingly protesting pro-Palestine. Here in Tasmania, I'm pretty much sure that if they tried to shut down the salmon industry, it would be even more prolific. That's an issue that people care about here. But just making a point too, the Albanese government gave $8 million to what's called the Blue Economy CRC, Cooperative Research Centre down here in Tasmania to support industries such as the seaweed growth industry, the salmon industry and the aquaculture industry at large. And now the Environment Minister is trying to unravel that. It doesn't really make sense to me. It probably won't make sense to a lot of Tasmanians.
Won't make sense to James. How many projects have been stopped up in Queensland because of mad green complaints about beetles and lizards and things? I mean, this is just crazy stuff. 700 people work in that Tasmanian salmon industry.
Steve, we've got the same issue here in Queensland between Tanya Plibersek and the Queensland State Labor Government. They've shut down a whole industry of fishing, which begins in the new year. Gillnet fishing, which happens very, very close to our coastline in very, very shallow waters, probably about 1.2 metres depth of water. have been shut down right across this state and into the Gulf. And what for? We've just killed an industry that not only fed Australians wholesome wild-caught fish like barramundi. No. We're going to get it from the sewers and these disgusting rivers from offshore now, like so much of our other fish that ends up on shelves in Australia. Not only that, but it's taken away from other industries. The gillnet fishing was not the issue. They weren't doing it on the Great Barrier Reef. Don't be misled by false statements by this Labor government, whether it be state or federal. So I empathise with those people in Tasmania. You've got a hell of a road ahead of you. You won't be given any consultation period. Here, they shut down this industry within 6 months and gave 5 weeks consultation for fishermen who've never, ever filled out a form to write a letter to government. I can assure you that. They've shut it down, gave them bugger all time to consult with government and given them this pissant amount of money to compensate them. I'm sorry, it's not good enough. And I again, empathise with those people in Tassie. If you don't want fresh fish, go back these governments. But I tell you what, you're going to destroy the wholesome food that we as Australians can produce in our fisheries. Sorry, bad news.
Yeah, well said, James. Good on you. Great to see you. Christy McSweeney, thank you also for your time and enjoy yourself down there in Hobart. Now, coming up after the break, we're now officially in the ceasefire and we're nervously, obviously, anticipating the release of the Israeli hostages. So where to next for the war in Gaza? Plus, even though all the evidence points to the Labor government falling well short of their lofty green targets, good old Chris Bowen, the minister, seems to think doubling down is the best option, but he might be in for a rude awakening when he gets to Dubai. They're going to lecture him about nuclear. More on that shortly. Welcome back. Steve Price filling in for Peter Credlin. Rita Panahi coming up. Now, we're all hoping that we'll get finally some good news from the conflict in Gaza tonight. The first 13 of 50 hostages held by Hamas inside Gaza, they're due to be released shortly. I think later tonight, maybe around midnight, a bit later than that. It's part of a 4-day ceasefire deal, which was finally reached after 6 weeks of very torrid fighting. But look, it's not all good news, as it was never going to be. We had a blast just across the border there just before the ceasefire kicked in at 4 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time today. But in exchange for Hamas releasing 50 innocent Israeli hostages, and some of them women, children, who were snatched from just over the border, Israel has agreed to release 150 Palestinian prisoners that are being held in its jails. Most of them are teenage boys. Joining me now to discuss this, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute senior analyst Malcolm Davis. Malcolm, nice to catch up with you again. 50 Israeli hostages for 150 Palestinians. You'd have to argue probably hardened criminals. Does that say to you that Israel's willing to do just about anything to get those hostages back?
I think probably any country would be willing to get its people back from being held hostage. I think that, if you look past examples, I think the Israelis exchanged about 2,000 prisoners for a single Israeli soldier held by Hezbollah. So I think there's a precedent set here. And I think that what you will see, hopefully, is Hamas living up to their end of the deal and releasing those 50 Israeli hostages. And in return, the Israelis will release those 150 criminals. As you say, most of them are teenage boys. There's none that are being released that have committed acts of violence against Israel.
Malcolm, we all had our eye on Sky just before 4 o'clock. At about 10 minutes to 4, there was the live vision of that massive explosion. It seemed to be on the Gaza side, huge amount of smoke. That's just before the ceasefire commenced. I mean, you can read whatever you like into it. I mean, you know much better than me. Is that Israel sending a message that, OK, we're going to stop in 10 minutes, but you've got to realise that once we get this hostage deal done, we're still coming for you if you are Hamas inside Gaza?
I think the Israelis have made that clear already, that they're not going to give up whilst Hamas is basically intact. If the Israelis did that, then Hamas would simply regroup, rearm and launch another October 7th style attack. and we'd be back where we started. So I think that the Israelis are sending a clear message to Hamas that this is a temporary thing, to exchange hostages, to bring in some aid into Gaza, and then the war will begin again. And I think the Israelis are correct in the sense that they cannot allow an organisation, a terrorist group like Hamas, to remain intact. They have to decisively defeat them. They have to destroy their leadership and their command and control such that Hamas can never regroup and once again threaten Israel.
So Israel is known to have some of the best intelligence in the world. They would have operatives inside Gaza, presumably, feeding back to them information on where the remaining Hamas terrorists are located. Do we think that we've got the majority of the innocent people out of that part of the north, and most of them are now in the south? Because it would appear once the hostages are released that Israel's going to go back in just as hard, Malcolm.
I think it's impossible to know just how many civilians are in the north at this point in time. There would be Palestinian civilians that are not part of Hamas that are caught in the crossfire. I think the Israelis will do everything they possibly can to avoid inflicting needless civilian deaths. And you've got this 4-day ceasefire, which potentially could be extended for a day for every 10 additional hostages that are released by Hamas. The Israelis will make good use of that in terms of gathering intelligence on what Hamas are doing. Hamas will be trying to regroup and rearm their own forces, and so the Israelis will be watching that very carefully and gathering intelligence so that when the war does begin again, they can be more effective and more decisive and precise in their attacks on Hamas.
I opened the program, Malcolm, talking about that boat arrival. 12 people, unidentified at the moment, turned up on the mainland, way up in the Kimberley, really very remote area. If it turns out that these 12 who are now on their way to Nauru are actually customers of people smugglers, how worried should we be that the people smuggling operation has considered that there's now a crack in our defence?
Look, one boat, I think, does not necessarily make a flood of illegal immigrants. I think we have to put this into perspective. Having said that, if the government does not do something to quickly strengthen our border protection, and if that is seen by people smugglers up in places like Indonesia and so forth, then we could see more people smuggling attempts coming towards our shores. And at that point, it does become more politically damaging for the government. So I think really it's down to Prime Minister Albanese and Defence Minister Richard Marles and the Foreign Minister Penny Wong to actually work quickly to ensure that the message is sent that we will not tolerate people smuggling. We will not tolerate a wave of boats coming to our northern coast. And it does now be the case that the ball is in their court.
Malcolm Davis, great to catch up. Thank you very much for that. Malcolm Davis looking after us on what's unfolding tonight in the Middle East. Now, I want to turn our attention to the deteriorating energy grid that is making it even harder for all of the families of Australia to put food on their table. Now, businesses are really struggling. We've got inflation and we've got power bills that continue to go through the roof. Now, this week, I find this quite extraordinary. Energy Minister Chris Bowen, now, we all know Chris Bowen's a zealot, but you would have thought that he has had enough advice from various departments that his ambition to get to net zero when he thinks he can get there is simply not going to happen. But he's doubled down on it. He's doubled down on, wind turbines and solar panels. Now, his plan is to use taxpayer money to get these projects, investment into these projects up and running. Joining me now to discuss this, former Resources Minister, Liberal National Party member for North Queensland seat of Hinkler, Keith Pitt. Keith, always good to see you. Chris Bowen's plan, as I read it, they're going to put out tenders for private enterprise to bid for projects. The winning tenderer will then build that project and taxpayers' money will also be put into that project. Once it's up and running, if it's profitable, the owners will give some money back to the Australian taxpayers. But the kicker on all of this that I could not believe is that if the projects are not profitable, then the Australian taxpayer are going to top up the piggy bank of the project. Is that right?
Well, how good is this, Steve? I was in business for a long time. I never found a deal like this. You put forward what your profit margin will be. The taxpayer will guarantee it. And then you'll have industry super funds and investment bankers and very large companies internationally come and sign up, build billions, tens of billions, and in fact we've seen reports that over $1 trillion worth of work needs to be done, and the taxpayer will guarantee your rate of return. I mean, what an extraordinary deal. Chris Bowen has made intermittent wind and solar so cheap that you need bucketfuls of the taxpayers' cash to make it happen.
So not only that, I mean, if you run the operation at a loss, you can claim the losses as a tax deduction anyway. You could run that at a loss for, say, 5 years, getting paid to have something that's not making any money, and then sell it to someone else. I mean, does he think we're stupid?
Oh, this is just extraordinary. He's absolutely lost touch with reality. The reason intermittent wind and solar isn't being invested in is because it's not technically or financially feasible. Right? That's the fundamental problem. You can't run the whole country on something which is so unreliable. They're going to make our electricity network the super unreliable power of the world. And yet we see changes suggested around the world, whether it's in the US or others, that they're going to expand their nuclear program because it works.
Well, he's off to Dubai. He's going to COP28. It's wonderful how they can never have these climate change summits over Zoom. They all have to jump on planes and fly there. Now, the Coalition's energy spokesman, Ted O'Brien, he's also going. He's going to deliver a speech to an organisation called the World Nuclear Association. Now, I know you've done some work around the world. You've done some trips yourself to look at the nuclear option. Bowen's not going to listen, though, is he?
Well, Federal Labor, if you recall in the last election, were always complaining about the Coalition being the outlier at these type of events. Well, guess who the outlier is now? This Federal Labor government. Because the world, they believe, the United States and others, think that their path to net zero runs through an expanded nuclear industry. Because it's quite simply energy that works, it's 100% reliable, it's something which is actually affordable compared to Chris Bowen and Prime Minister Albanese's plan. And you don't have to worry about building all of these transmission lines everywhere, upsetting the community, upsetting farmers, knocking down literally thousands of acres of koala habitat. You just build stuff that works. How about that?
You've been around a long time and you've been in government where policies obviously have been seen not to work or not to be good policy. It's rare that a government admits a mistake and says, OK, stop. We've actually got to have a rethink here because A, we're not going to get to those targets. B, those targets are unnecessary for Australia as a nation. And C, we're going to ruin the economy. Do you think this mob have the backbone to actually make an error and say that they've made an error and apologise?
Well, D, think of all of those sectors where significant investments have been made, or their taxpayer assets, like coal-fired power in Queensland, that they're simply going to send down the river, make completely unviable, and they'll be broken because they won't be able to compete with someone who was funded by Treasury. So the idea that Labor will apologise and say they've got it wrong, I think there's zero chance of that. The only way that this can be moved is by the Australian people at the next election. So we'll be taking forward a suite of policies. They'll be announced a reasonable time before the campaign comes up. But Ted's over there and he'll be looking at nuclear, obviously. And I've seen Peter out today talking about it as well. We just have to have practical, common sense policies that people can afford. It's straightforward, right? This is just physics and engineering 101. You want stability in your network, you want your network to be reliable. And if we look at the proposal there, mate, Chris Bowen hasn't considered reliability or cost to the consumer and business.
He's also said he doesn't want to talk about gas. I mean, these people are crazy.
Well, they're also funding the Environmental Defenders Office with taxpayers' money to take on gas projects like the Beetaloo, like Scarborough, like Barossa, and put them out of business. After they've started, they've had their approvals, they've spent a few $1 billion, and they're all parked up for gas that we actually need. There's no way this stuff will be built in the time frame Labor is proposing. The only losers here are the Australian people, and in particular those who can least afford it.
Keith, have a great weekend. Always good to catch up with you. Thank you very much. After the break, those disgusting scenes, and I deliberately use that word disgusting. You had school students yesterday walked out of school in Melbourne, and today it was Sydney's idea. Now, I believe that most of them have zero idea of what they are actually talking about. Welcome back. Steve Price in for Peter Credlin. Now, I defy anyone who watched TV news across Australia last night and again tonight to not be completely shocked by what they saw in those school marches, school kids leaving school to go and march in favour of Palestine, marching for Palestine. Happened in Melbourne yesterday, outside Flinders Street Station, then they marched up to the State Library. Sydney today, where, again, kids left school, and to his credit, New South Wales Premier Chris Minns said it shouldn't have happened. Now, they're protesting in solidarity with Hamas-run Palestine. I don't believe that most of those teenage children there had any idea of what they were doing. And it seems to me that these protest marches are being organised by university radicals. Joining me to discuss this, and I'll prove that to you in a moment, is Executive Manager of Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, Joel Burney. Joel, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
I want to play for you some audio that Sky got today from some of those school children at the Sydney rally, and I'd like to get your view on it. Let's have a look.
I think it's only fair that everyone should get an equal amount of education, and people in Gaza and Palestine are all being bombed and not being able to get education. So it's only fair if we come and take time out of our time to educate, to protest for them.
Not only just because I'm Palestinian, but because I'm human. If you say that we should be in the schools, that we need the education ourselves, I agree everyone should be educated, but so should the people in Palestine.
Joel, I'm not sure they know what they're talking about. We saw it again yesterday, I think probably even worse in Melbourne, where they were chanting from the river to the sea. What's your view of schools letting children attend these rallies? And secondly, some of these school children have got to go back into classrooms where there are Jewish students. Now, that's going to make them feel very uneasy, if not unsafe, right?
Well, I think that the Jewish community is reeling from record high levels of anti-Semitism since one of the worst massacres ever perpetrated against a people occurred on October the 7th. So in Australia, the Jewish community has witnessed over a 500% increase in anti-Semitic incidents against our community. And then to see young, impressionable students, high school students, going to the lengths of taking a day off to be drip-fed exploitative propaganda from people who are older than them, and to spew genocidal hatred remarks such as "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," just adds to the difficult nature that Jews find themselves in. To hear such young people say things like Hamas is doing a good job, it penetrates deeply into the psyche and the hearts and the emotions of an already petrified community in the Australian Jewish community. And the idea that somehow that these young kids can be exploited by the pro-Palestinian campaigners and radicals, as you suggest in your opening, is quite disgusting.
Joel, I was filling in on Peter's program 2 weeks ago on a Friday. You'll remember what happened on that Friday. There was a synagogue that was attacked by Palestinian protesters. Has it gotten any better since then? Because the general Melbourne community and the Australian public in general were absolutely shocked at what happened on that Friday night. Is it gotten better or worse?
Well, it certainly hasn't. That incident hasn't happened again, so I don't know whether or not you could suggest that that means that things are getting better. But I guess you could argue that things are not getting worse. But then again, for a number of the Jewish community to see the type of vicious rhetoric that's coming out of such a young protest, and seeing so many young high schoolers come out in Sydney and Melbourne over the past 48 hours, certainly doesn't necessitate an opinion that things are getting better. The scenes that we saw in Caulfield 2 weeks ago on that Friday night, still send chills down the spine of regular Australian Jews. The mob came into our neighbourhood, and I think it's quite One story coming out of that protest, Steve, was that the police were telling some of the Jews on the other side of the road, yelling at them to go home, and they said, "We are home. We're outside the front of our house, outside the front of our house of worship on the Sabbath." And hundreds of angry pro-Palestinian mobsters come into the centre of Jewish suburbs in Melbourne to freak everyone out. This is a terrible situation. And unfortunately, what's happened on the streets of Melbourne and Sydney over the past 48 hours is just another example of it.
Joel, we've not seen Israeli protests. We've not seen Jewish Australians out there protesting, except there was a bloke today who attempted to walk past that demonstration in Sydney with an Israeli flag. Have a look at what happened to him.
So you're holding my hand. Take your hands off me. I will walk down. I will walk peacefully. Do not touch me.
Now, he's emotional. We don't condone him laying a hand on that police officer, but there seems to be two rules for either side of this equation.
Well, there's no doubt that our protesting tactics are quite different from the other side. So you'll see a number of Jewish gatherings which have been rather solemn and emotive in tone, maybe some candle vigils, maybe some singing of songs, but also looking forward and our hearts and minds focused on those hostages that are in Gaza and on those 1,200 people that unfortunately perished on October the 7th. So you will see the differences there. But look, in terms of a double standard, seeing one lone Israeli flag amongst hundreds of Palestinian flags on the streets. You've seen in the motorbike convoys from Western Sydney into the Jewish areas of Coogee and Bondi. Hundreds of Palestinian flags have been flown here, there and everywhere. But now this is the second scene that I've witnessed over the past couple of months where the lone courageous pro-Israel person with a flag is hastily taken away by police. So these scenes are again quite troubling to Jewish people, and the community is concerned that at some stages there are examples of that double standard.
Joel Burney, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Now, still to come, one of the few Conservative voices at the ABC has announced that he's leaving, meaning there's even less hope for balance at the taxpayer-funded broadcaster. Plus, bureaucrats are still pushing, can you believe this, for a 4-day week in Victoria. I mean, honestly, they don't do much anyway, and they want to work 4 days a week. I'm sure my panel will have something to say about this next. Steve Price in for Peter Credlin. Now, I like to call these two the Power Panel. Sky News contributors Prue McSween and Tina McQueen join us on a Friday night. Great to see you both. News has been pretty grim for a few weeks now. I just thought we'd talk about something that I found really positive today. The mayors of the Gold Coast and Perth. So you've got Tom Tate on the Gold Coast, who's a real character, and you've got in Perth, of course, you've got Basil Zemplis, who's my old mate from the AFL calling days. They've proposed hosting a coast-to-coast 2026 Commonwealth Games. Now, I'm in Victoria that is going to spend, I think it's up to about $800 million not having the Commonwealth Games. The idea has the backing of mining entrepreneur Gina Reinhardt. Now, when Gina wants something to happen, she makes it happen. Now, Tina, you're close to Gina, you work with her.
Yes.
Tell us why this is such a fabulous idea, because I think it's great.
Look, firstly, she feels for the athletes who train hard, and their two big highlights are the Commonwealth Games and the Olympic Games. Of course, some just, don't have a huge chance in the Olympic Games and can pick up a medal in the Commonwealth Games. That's the first thing. The second thing is Mrs. Reinhardt loves Australia and doesn't want to see the Commonwealth Games go anywhere else or not happen at all. I mean, she's quite serious about this. There's some other big backers too that think it's an absolute stellar idea to have these games across the country, and I think it's getting a little bit of legs. The problem is, of course, the governments, but there are ways that we might just privatise them, Steve, and tell the premiers to go jump.
Yeah, and we won't give any free tickets to Daniel Andrews. He'll be the last bloke we're going to invite. Prue, the idea is on the Gold Coast you have the swimming, because obviously beaches and sunshine and all the great things that they have there. And then over to Perth, where you've got that magnificent Optus Stadium, which you can use for the athletics. And then they're going to bring rowing back into the Commonwealth Games. They're going to have rowing on the Swan River. I think this is a really clever idea. Now, you know, there will be some taxpayers' money in it, but do you think we could make this work?
Oh, definitely. In fact, multi-hosting is becoming the norm. I believe that upcoming games are going to be shared by Morocco, Portugal and Spain. And I think for Australia, this is wonderful because A, we redeem our reputation. B, it's going to be a wonderful boost to tourism when we're showcasing either side of the continent. You know, Gina Rinehart, I'm a staunch monarchist, but I have to say, if we could make Gina Rinehart a president, I'd switch to Republican. This woman has vision, she's got business acumen, and she's got guts. And sadly, no other politician has that.
Tina, I thought Prue was going to make Gina Queen of Australia for a moment there. I thought
she is almost now.
Well, I think, as Prue said, I think she already is Queen of Australia, Steve. She's got that crown already.
Now, let's talk about our friends at the ABC. I'm very inclined to go on LinkedIn and apply for a job at the ABC just to see what might happen. But Radio National's Tom Switzer, Tina's just quit the ABC. He was, I think, apart from Amanda Vanstone, and you wouldn't call her a staunch conservative by any means.
No.
He was the only one in the entire network. And they're supposed to be under their charter diversity of view, not just diversity of skin colour and ethnicity. There's no diversity of view there. And so if Switzer goes, how are they going to explain to the people of Australia that they are able to give views from both sides?
Oh, look, Tim, Switzer is a great talent. It's a shame that he'll be leaving there, but I think he's had enough. He's done a number of years there. Clearly they don't want him there, and he doesn't want to be anywhere where he's not wanted. It's an absolute tragedy and disgraceful there is not a single Conservative voice on the ABC. Steve, I don't think they'd let you in the front door, to be honest, but, you know, they're stupid because you have a huge audience across when you on radio and television, so they'd be mad, but they wouldn't consider it.
Prue, what a punish it would be to work there. That'd be the only problem. I mean, imagine
Steve,
having to deal with the people who are trying to produce your show.
Well, you'd be better getting a job at KISS, mate.
Yeah, thanks. Speaking of journalists, the National Journalists Union apparently have distributed an open letter calling for the media to apply the same professional scepticism, Prue, to uncorroborated, their words, not mine, Israeli government information as it applies to Hamas, comparing Israel to Hamas. Now, seriously, these people are going to be joking. So this letter's gone out, and I think quickly the Nine newspapers have realised what a big issue this is going to be, and they've said, if you sign this letter as a member of our staff, you will not be covering the actual conflict itself.
I'm so glad that they're taking a stand. This is appalling. I mean, there has not been even-handed coverage, as we know. We've seen, and this is a problem now with wars. I mean, wars are a problem generally, but now that journalists can virtually be at the front line and, you know, determine and barrack virtually by their reporting and opinions for a side, as they are doing quite blatantly for the Palestine-Hamas side, and, you know, Israel's copping a huge bollocking. And, you know, when you look at the pressure that's coming on them from the UN, from the rest of the world, and now journalists, the media are entering it, vilifying them and making the Palestinians, because of the Hamas regime, who are the victims because of Hamas, you know, we're finding that we've got this biased coverage. And so journalists need to be really careful because a lot of their credibility has gone down the toilet.
Yeah, look, I'm going to run out of time, but I wanted to ask Tina about the fact that Victoria, can you believe this? Victorian public servants, Tina, only want to work a 4-day week. Tell Gina about that. See if they get a job working for Gina if they could only work a 4-day week. Thank you both, as usual. Tina McQueen and Prue McSween, my power panel. Peter Credlin will be back with you on Monday. Rita Panahi is up next.